As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a very important returning guest today. John Rubino, founder of DollarCollapse.com, is here with us again, joining us on Reluctant Preppers. Thank you, John, for joining us.
Oh, hi, Donegan. Good to talk to you again.
Since we met at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium where you spoke about truth and falsehood in commerce, we've had you back on our channel a couple of times, and this time I'd like to follow up with you on some concepts that were recently included in a video you selected for your top 10 videos on your DollarCollapse.com top 10 section, specifically one from July 27th of 16 by McElvaney Weekly Commentary interviewing Richard Duncan on how creditism has replaced capitalism. Now, we've talked about a lot of different economic theories on our channel, but we haven't talked about creditism, and I thought that was a very interesting expose that they got into analyzing what was the huge shift that happened with the separation of currencies from the gold standard back in 1971. But if you can kind of take us back prior to 1964, when we kind of abandoned silver in our coinage, or earlier, what is the big change that happened with money in the 20th century, and why would we be calling the new system that we're on today creditism versus capitalism?
Well, really, prior to 1971, for basically all of human history, money was mostly a real thing. It was either gold and or silver themselves, or it was paper money circulating that represented gold and silver in a tangible way. And the advantage of that kind of a system is that gold and silver, the supply of gold and silver, tend to rise in a predictable way at a rate that's consistent with the increase in human populations. It's about 2% a year. And so if that's your money, or if you link your money to those things, then the supply of your money can only go up at that rate. And you have a system where money is reasonably scarce, it grows at a predictable rate, and therefore there's no incentive to take crazy risks by borrowing way too much money and investing it in things that we would now call malinvestment. And in 1971, though, that's a restrictive problem, or restrictive situation for a government, having sound money, because it means governments can't just spend anything they want to fight any war they want, invade people, and buy elections by creating huge cradle-to-grave social programs. All of that is hard for a government that deals with tangible money, because it has to go get that money from somewhere. It can't just create it out of thin air. But in 1971, we finally changed all that. We finally cut governments loose from any connection to real things, and just basically handed them a unlimited credit card. Beginning with the closure of the gold window by Richard Nixon in 1971, the world's major governments had fiat currencies that were not limited by any external factor. They could print as many new Deutschmarks or French francs or US dollars as they wanted to. And so handing that kind of power to elected officials and their appointed bureaucrats basically got us exactly what you would expect, given what we now know about human nature. It corrupted all the major governments of the world, and it created a financial system that was no longer based on borrowing conservatively for productive uses. We're deeply now into what Richard Duncan calls creditism, and what Hyman Minsky, an economist who got a lot of this stuff very clearly back in the day, calls Ponzi finance. And basically, we're borrowing ever larger amounts of money, and we're using the proceeds from that borrowing for ever more speculative ends. And so debt is soaring around the world, and at every level of society, the amount of credit that's being created is going through the roof. And every government is over indebted. Every sector of consumer or business society is also over indebted. And we've reached the point where there's no real way out of this. We owe so much money at every level of every society that the only fix is something that's really wrenching for the average person. Either we inflate it away by creating huge amounts of new currency and making our debts easy to cover because we're paying them back in extremely depreciated currency, or we collapse under the weight of all our debt, default en masse, and have a 1930s style depression. And that's it. Those are our only two choices. And when you reach a point where society has been this financialized, historically, one of those two things has happened. The difference this time around is that the phenomenon is global instead of local. It used to be that one country would screw up like this. France, after the French Revolution, decides to go to paper money to cover all the social promises that the new government has decided to make. And so they destroy their currency. Or Germany after World War I can't cover its war reparations, so they run the printing presses and they destroy their currency. In Latin America has this happen every couple of decades for mostly every country. And because it's localized, it doesn't affect the global economy on any really systemically dangerous scale. But we're doing it everywhere now. Japan is at the government level the most heavily indebted country that has ever existed. China just got done borrowing more money in a 5-year period than any country has ever borrowed before. Europe, if you take their unfunded liabilities into account, might be the most over-indebted part of the global economy right now. And the U.S., of course, our numbers are horrendous. We've been borrowing huge amounts of money at not just the government level, but at business levels and consumers too. We've been encouraging our consumers to borrow more money than any other group of individuals has ever borrowed in human history. And so everybody's grossly over indebted, and we're all headed for some kind of a crisis, but we're all kind of going that way together. And that's what makes this such a unique and scary time.
Now, you mentioned China in that, and most people don't realize, most people have been told in the U.S. that for decades now, we've had this huge trade imbalance with China. We've sent them all of our money. They sent us all of their goods. So they must be flush with cash, right? Because we've been sending them money for decades. And yet, China, both at the local and regional level as well as at the national level, sovereign level, is supposedly has just a hugely increased debt. Now, that was one of the things that Richard Duncan also, it was quite fascinating, the expose you posted there, because he talked about what most people don't realize about what's been going on with China, the mega trends that have been affecting it. He talked about the labor, their low-cost labor being so available now on a global scale that suddenly it's putting huge pressure on a glut of labor available globally. He talked about them having built this, kept using investment to build capacity. In other words, using debt to build capacity, that they've built more in a steel capacity, more in cement capacity, and more in all kinds of manufacturing capacity than they have any hope of being able to consume locally, or that even the rest of the world can consume since 2008. And he talked about that the combination of these means that they can't function fully, can't thrive alone as an economy, but it only makes sense when you look at them as the second largest economy in the world, in America, United States of America as the largest currently, to be Chimerica, and as far as how those go together. But did you have any further commentary on so people can understand the implications on the global? This isn't just a Chinese phenomenon, what's happening in China. It's going to affect everyone. Do you have any specific points about the mega trends in China and how they spell important significance for us in the U.S. or for the global economy?
Well, yeah, it's crucial to understand that the reason the global economy recovered to the extent that it has recovered from the 2008-2009 crisis is that China quintupled its national debt. They just borrowed, I think it's $15 or $20 trillion is the final number now, and they used that money to, as you said, build capacity in a lot of basic industries. They produced more cement in a 3-year period not so long ago than the U.S. has produced in the past 100 years. And that bid up the price of all these raw materials that China was buying in order to build out their infrastructure in this way. And that energized the basic side of the global economy and gave us a recovery. But China's kind of running out of steam now. They've borrowed, I think they can borrow a little more, but not a whole lot more from here. And that means their infrastructure build out and their demand for raw materials is moderating now. And that's why the global economy isn't taking off the way you'd think it would with negative interest rates all around the world and all these gigantic QE programs now ongoing. And since China isn't going to be the engine of growth going forward, the other economies that used to sell things to China, that sold all the raw materials that China was buying up, are now slowing down. See, Brazil is in a massive financial crisis right now, in part because they can't sell as much to China as they used to. The U.S. GDP number just came out, and it was grossly lower than expectations. We're growing at maybe 1.5% a year right now, which 6 or 7 years into a recovery is crazy low. We should be overheating right now. And we're not. We're kind of sputtering to a full stop here. And Japan and Europe are basically in the same boat. They've got deflation. The prices are actually going down right now, even though interest rates are so low. In other words, the global economy minus China as this hyper-leveraged engine of growth is sputtering to a stop right now. And it's not apparent what picks up the slack, if anything does. Japan is doing a new stimulus program, but Japan has already been doing stimulus programs since literally the 1990s, and it's gotten them nowhere. And Europe now is a mess, in part because of the uncertainty stemming from Brexit. You never know who else is going to try to pull out of the European Union. And so overall, the European Union economy is not growing much at all. And, the U.S. is considered to be the best of the bunch, but that's not saying much if we're only growing at 1 or 1.5%. So with all the debt that we've taken on, if we can't grow aggressively to allow the size of the global economy to outpace the increase in overall debt, then we are kind of in a death spiral. And I think that that's where we find ourselves now, with no real solution, because if interest rates are already, negative 0.05%, would making interest rates negative 0.1% suddenly solve our problems? Highly unlikely. It's actually a deflationary thing, negative interest rates, we're finding out. And we don't have any other tools.
Yeah, and that's the tools. You got right on it. The interview with Richard Duncan was also interesting because they talked about trying to fight the new war with the old war's methods or the old war's tools. And they talked about these sort of generations of thought, of economic thought that have gone by. And just quickly, I thought that the direction that they were going was one that was on sound footing, but then I kind of got disoriented in the last 20 or 30 minutes of the interview because it just seemed like they were taking off into advocating just stepping the foot on the accelerator ever so much more, so we just haven't even tried hard enough yet or something. And it reminded me when we hear about the roaring 20s of the early 20th century, when that was just a great bubble of the post World War I economy, and then it collapsed and fell into the Great Depression. And then it reminded me of the dot-com boom in the late 20th century. I remember Alan Greenspan coming on time and time again, giving his speech. People were wondering, well, is the Fed going to, have to put the brakes on this highly overvalued stock market? I mean, some of the stocks were at hundreds to 1 of PE ratios, and yet Greenspan would talking about. I remember him saying, the old rules of productivity just don't seem to apply to this. It's a new type of an economy, this new information economy, and maybe we're in a brave new world here, and we can't use the old guidelines to and then the dot-com boom popped, and down came a lot of those high-flying stocks, and some of those high-dollar stocks went away completely, went to zero, and it gives me this experience, and even in the discussion, Richard Duncan was talking about how Austrian economics is over 100 years old, and it doesn't have they couldn't have possibly taken into account the possibilities that are in our current situation, what's possible today. And it just reminded me of the movie The Matrix, where you're just kind of in this virtual world, and it's like all the normal rules don't apply. And there was even a quote in that interview that talked about where the markets are floating on an ocean of fiat, and how the governments need to just keep on debting to infinity, and maybe that they can just keep on doing this for decades. A couple of times in the article I said maybe they can just keep this going for decades, because to stop would mean death. And so we've just got to keep on going, and it doesn't matter. And the central banks can just cancel out the debt and just keep on going. And that just clashed in my mind, that thought of living in this virtual world where gravity no longer applies, the old rules, the old wisdom, common sense, responsibility, limits on behavior don't apply. It just seemed like so much, the potential for so much human pride and human hubris to enter into that, where we think now we're just I guess godlike in our powers, and rules don't apply to us anymore, versus sort of in contrast to that, we sometimes vacation in various Amish countries, these pastoral countrysides where people do honest days hard work and they get honest income from it, and if you work harder, you get more for your family, and whatever you have, you own, and you save it aside, and you live off less than you earn, so that you set aside for the future, and you can build up wealth for yourself. You can pass down wealth to the future generations. And people, it's not the whims of some huge powers that be out there aren't determining the whether or not your work is going to be whether what you've set aside is going to have any worth, or just go to zero and just disappear or get turned upside down. And that's the question is of are we? They said a couple of times in that interview that we're now playing with forces that we've never had before in human history, and that the extent to which our financial world is leveraged has never been encountered before. You mentioned all the countries of the world being on fiat currency, not backed by anything. Has never in the history of the world have we been in these waters before. It reminds me of like Nikolai Tesla. They say when he was doing his experiments with high voltage, that he was actually trying to do weather control and that kind of thing. And just wondering what your take is on this. Do humans always fall for this idea that, oh, this time it'll be different, this time we're in control, and doesn't the story always end the same, that they find out that there are actual laws in the universe and you can't just defy gravity forever?
Yeah, absolutely. There are financial laws just as there are physical laws, and you violate them at your peril. And here's the reason why we can't keep on doing this forever. Because imagine a world in which it's explicit government policy to devalue the currency year after year after year, and then every once in a while just to eliminate all the debts. What is your rational response to that? It would be to borrow as much money as possible, right? So all of society would go on a borrowing binge because you know that you're going to be paying that money back in cheaper currency. And every once in a while, the government's just going to eliminate all your debts. So you just go for it. Live high on the hog, buy the biggest house possible, all the toys that go into it, and take nice vacations and max out all your credit cards. And you don't worry about it because you know that the government has your back. Well, if all of society does that, then you get the Austrian economics crack-up boom. You know, Austrian economics actually did get this. I can't believe anybody would say that it's a philosophy and a science that's not equipped for today's world, because we're living their script right now. You know, we've passed through the different phases of financing, and we're deeply into the final stage, which is the blow-off stage, where everybody's borrowing so much money with such complete abandon that the system just spins out of control, you know, and that they've sketched this out perfectly. We're right there, except it's on a global scale. And so a crack-up boom is the point at which a critical mass of people figure out that that's the government's policy to make the currency cheaper year after year and to maybe just refund all your debts at some point. And so they lose faith in the currency. You know, the flip side of you wanting to borrow a lot is you not wanting to hold any currency that the government is making less and less valuable all the time. So as soon as you get paid, you spend your paycheck. You buy whatever you can buy that's real, that has actual utility for whatever price you have to pay. And the system spins out of control in a kind of hyperinflation. But it's not due to an overwhelmingly increased supply of the currency. It's due to a collapse in confidence in the currency by the currency's holders. And when that happens, it happens quickly. You know, it's not something where you ramp up the currency by 10% a year for a long time. It's where everybody just says, I don't want to hold this anymore. And boom, you know, in 1 or 2 years, the currency just ceases to function as a currency. You know, Weimar Germany, their hyperinflation, which was so extraordinary that we still remember it and still talk about it today, only took 2 years. It was a pretty decent currency. And then in, you know, a relative blink of an eye, it just ceased to function. People were taking wheelbarrows full of it to the grocery store, and they were burning it in fireplaces to keep warm. And that's kind of what we're headed for here if you take the current policies to their logical extreme, as in that interview that you're referencing. You know, if we try to do that, we will blow up our currency. It's not complicated. It's basic human nature to respond to our environment. And if you create a crazy environment, you end up with people behaving in crazy ways. We've done it many times in the past, and we'll do it again this time, it sounds like.
And the trick is, or one of the tricks, it seems, is for responsible individuals to decide when to get off their merry-go-round or how to get off the merry-go-round, because you can see that there's a concerted effort on the part of all of the nations of the world to keep this system going, to keep it inflated, to keep reinflating it if it partially deflates as it did in 2008. And so it's quite tempting to just to keep a foot in the market, or to keep trying to figure out how you're going to play both sides of this, because there are these huge forces at play. When people start talking about the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities and in futures markets, all of the derivatives, the exposure that all the companies and all the nations have and everything. I mean, our eyes just glaze over. We just become numb because the mind can't even fathom that. The reason they can't is because you have a gut sense in some level for how big the world is and how many people there are in it and how much value we can create. And when you start saying numbers that are orders of magnitude greater than reality, that's when you start to realize there's something huge going on here, and people are understandably concerned. Well, is it going to break this way or that way? Are we going to be plunged into deflation, or are we going to be into hyperinflation like you talked about? And they mentioned in the interview that capitalists are lost because entrepreneurs really can't look for valid signals anymore from the price discovery mechanism. That was also an interview you did with Jay Taylor where you talked about that. And individuals are at a loss because, like sports teams that are watching helplessly to watch how the other team in the final is going to do, whether they're going to win or lose against them, but they have a feeling that you don't control your own destiny, and it's a terrible situation for the dignity of human persons to be sitting there kind of watching forces that are unimaginably bigger than they are playing out, and feeling that they're just helpless to these. They have no way of determining their own destiny. But that isn't really the end of the story, right? Regardless of what these ego-based or whatever is driving these huge forces one way or the other, there are things that individuals can do. And even like the story of Noah's Ark, where you're building the ark and all the people are laughing and jeering and saying, hey, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your energy, you could be off like us, enjoying life. How do you remind yourself? How do you remind others to keep your feet on the ground, keep your head clear, and take responsibility for your future in a way that you're not going to regret, but no matter which way the huge forces take things?
Well, with your finances, you want to step off the roller coaster as soon as possible. Convert your financial assets like dollar cash, your bank account, your bond funds, which are basically just dollar denominated financial instruments that send you more dollars every year, and then eventually they give you back your original dollars. If it's going to be the government's policy to make dollars less and less valuable, then you don't want to play that game. You don't want to be suckered in to the wrong side of that equation. You want to turn your dollars into real stuff, and that would be gold and silver and very well chosen real estate and farmland and maybe some energy assets, things like that, things that governments just can't create in unlimited quantities the way they're creating currency right now. And with your personal life, it's a little trickier, but you also want to try to become as self-sufficient as possible, because when things really spin out of control, you just can't predict with any kind of certainty what the big systems are going to be like. What will the supply chains be that serve your grocery stores now, that are now global? They're shipping stuff from Chile and Europe and Asia to your grocery store. Will that still work if there's some kind of a big financial crisis? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But if you've got a garden out back and you're growing lots of tomatoes and green beans and things like that and canning them for the winter, so that you have 6 months worth of food down there in your basement that you produced, that is at a minimum peace of mind. And in a worst case scenario, could be something that helps you get through a time when it's not easy to live the life that you're used to living now. And on your job, the assumption has to be that the employment market is going to be kind of dicey and unsettled. If not catastrophically bad, then still there will be a lot of creative destruction going on. And that your job won't be as secure as it has been in the past. So you want to make yourself as indispensable as possible. Don't just show up and do the job that you're paid to do for 8 hours a day and then go home. Figure out what the people in charge who are going to make the decisions about who to keep and who to fire when the time comes, figure out what they need. And be one of the people who voluntarily gives it to them, so that when the time comes to go down the list and see who's not going to be there tomorrow, they're going to look at you and say, no, we got to keep that guy. And so you want to be that person. So there are lots of things you can do, and almost all of them involve becoming more self-sufficient. In other words, gold and silver become the base money in your portfolio rather than something that you can't control because governments are messing with it. And your garden becomes your food security rather than the grocery store down the street. And your varied skills and willingness to take on new challenges gives you a better chance of staying at your job than you might have had otherwise. These are all things that the average person can do. And none of them is foolproof. Nothing guarantees the future, but taken together, they give you a lifestyle that has a better chance of sailing through what's coming than the way most people live right now. So, as a finance guy, I always come back to gold and silver and mining stocks and things like that, because there's a chance that you can make a lot of money when, or at least preserve your purchasing power at a fairly high level when the government is doing crazy stuff like this. So begin with some silver coins. If you're not already stacking, you should be stacking, and some mining stocks. They've had phenomenal runs lately, so they're due for a correction. But when that correction happens, they're going to go back to being extraordinarily cheap investments in a world where there aren't very many of those out there. So pay attention to the mining sector and be prepared to grab some really high quality gold and silver miners if they get a little cheaper, and then ride them for the next 5 years. As long as governments are going to be actively trying to destroy their currencies, the mining sector, at least the highest quality part of the gold and silver mining sector, will be the growth stocks of that generation.
As long as you're speaking of mining stocks, can you give our viewers an understanding of why they've been beaten down so badly over the last half decade?
Well, gold and silver peaked after a really long run. They went up for, I think, 12 or 13 straight years. And that led investors to become really speculative in the gold and silver mining sector. They were paying premiums for the number of ounces in the ground that a miner had when, and they weren't paying attention to how economic those resources were. In other words, how cheap was it to get that gold out? We don't care about that because gold is going up forever. So the more gold you have in the ground, the more valuable it's going to be long term. Well, investors wanted that. And that led the mining executives to go out and start buying high cost, low quality resources and paying a premium for them. And so by the time the gold bull market petered out in 2011, 2012, you had a case where most of the mining industry had grossly overpaid for the resources that it had and had borrowed way too much money. So the industry itself just imploded. And it took them 3 years to get their costs down to a reasonable level at which they can kind of sort of make money. And so they did that at the same time that gold was bottoming and starting to go back up again. And so in the first half of this year, you had a lot of gold miners, double, triple, quadruple. And that shows you what can happen in this industry when things break right. And so I think that that's probably an indication of things to come. You know, we've missed the first doubling or tripling or quadrupling with a lot of these stocks, and maybe they're going to correct from here because that was a really fast, really hard move. But if they do correct, let's say some of them go down by 30 or 40% from here, there is going to be some very tasty entry points for a lot of these stocks. And for a few years at least, it's reasonable to expect the miners to manage themselves well before they get all excited and start screwing up again. So you'll have a situation in which the underlying prices for gold and silver are going in the right direction, and miners have had a near-death experience recently enough to prevent them from starting to play stupid financial games again. And so you get a healthy industry, you know, where they're able to sell their gold and silver for higher prices year after year, but their costs remain low and their margins just blow out and they make lots of money. And that's probably the situation for gold and silver miners over the next 2 or 3 years. So it's going to be a great place to be. And you just have to choose wisely, because even in good times, there are a lot of miners that just cease to exist. You know, they make company-specific mistakes and either just go way down in stock price or they just cease to exist completely. And so you want to buy the highest quality of whatever category you're looking at. If it's the seniors, then you've got some high profile names to pick. If you've got the mid tiers, there are some good names you may not have heard of, but you can look them up, find out who are held in highest esteem by the smart people in the industry. And then if there are juniors, you know, the exploration companies and the little companies, they will be like lottery tickets. Some of them will cease to exist. Some of them will go up 10 times from here. And so you need help for that. You've got to subscribe to a newsletter like Jay Taylor's newsletter that's been around for 20 or 30 years and has a good record of picking junior miners. Or there are 3 or 4 other people out there who are in that same category and, you know, have been at it for a while and who are really good at helping their clients figure out what junior miners to buy and which ones to avoid. And, you know, spend a few $100s on one of those newsletters, and it will pay you back multiple times, orders of magnitude, by allowing you to pick some of the big winners in the coming bull market in junior mining shares.
Now, on our channel, some people have expressed specific concern around the potential for government seizing of precious metals in times of crisis, and they refer back to 1933, where there was actually a government order about people not being able to hold gold bullion as individuals, that sort of thing, for investment purposes. But others have written that they thought with as few people that are actually holding significant amounts of gold and as far distributed that it is from household to household, that's the hard game. If the government to go that way, it would be much harder than to just nationalize gold mines themselves and the gold producers, and people consider that to be a risk against thinking that you're going to be able to have any kind of windfall without having that just taken away from you from the government if a crisis or if hard times hit. So what's your personal take and the people you've talked with about the risk and the potential for government seizure of gold mines or gold mining operations in the times of crisis?
Well, yeah, you never want to bet the farm on the good intentions or competence of government. They will do things that shock us when it really hits the fan here. And one of those things might be nationalizing some of the gold and silver mines. Now, ways around that include buying gold and silver mines that are headquartered in other countries, so that whichever country goes craziest, maybe you've got some miners that are in one of the less crazy countries. You diversify in that way. And then you own physical precious metals, which if you've already got it, it's harder for the government to take it away from you. And then of the physical precious metals that you own, put them in different geographic locations. If you're able to buy enough to make that feasible, store some in a vault in Singapore, for instance. Bury some in the backyard. Put some in a safe deposit box at your bank. Put it in 2 or 3 other places. And in that way, you spread your risks widely enough to guarantee, or not guarantee, but increase the odds that some of it is going to survive whatever crazy stuff happens. Because remember, we can't predict the details of any of this. We just know we're headed into a time of turmoil when the people in charge are going to do things that in normal times would seem unfeasible, and yet they're going to do it. We don't know which crazy things they're going to try, but we know that some are coming. And so the more broadly you can diversify yourself, the better chance you have of coming through it with some of your capital intact. And that's really all we can hope for, because I think the idea that everything we buy right now and everything we own is going to be untouched by the capital controls and the wealth confiscations and the excise taxes and things like that are going to be brought out and sold to a terrified public, when the time comes. It's unrealistic. You're not going to be able to keep everything that you own. One way or another, terrified governments will take some of it away from you. And the trick is going to be to spread it around widely enough so that they can't get it all. Maybe they can only get a third of it, and you keep 2/3. And that's going to be a pretty good outcome, I think, in some of the worst case scenarios that are being tossed around out there.
Well, and there are a lot of those scenarios, and the tagline for your dollarcollapse.com website is your ringside seat for the global financial crisis. And if people go there, John, what are the resources that they can find that you make available for them there?
Well, and anything I write appears there, and it's also got a daily updated list of stories that appear on other websites and elsewhere on the internet that cover the stuff you and I have talked about today. And so it's updated continuously. So the idea is to make dollarcollapse.com the kind of place where you go and visit for an hour in the morning, and you're up to speed on what happened overnight and the big trends, and you're generally ready to kind of sort of understand the world that you live in.
We really appreciate you joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers and thinking about these big forces that are at play. We keep learning more and more about them, and I think one of the things you said is helpful here near the end is to diversify your approach to that, but do it in a way that's emphasizes your self-reliance and also doesn't put all your eggs necessarily in one basket or all your baskets in one place. So just appreciate your being here with us on Reluctant Preppers, John, and we'd love to have you back again.
Thanks, Donegan.